Okay, so let me pick up a little bit where we were. Like I normally don't do a lot of video lectures to finish what we didn't get to in class, but it's kind of been hard getting back on track after interim, and this one is an important one. So, we talked about Alexander Hamilton, right, and how he really, Secretary of Treasury, right, he's the one that really set up our financial stability as a country. And sorry, if you look down here at this chart, we talked about how how is the United States going to pay for the funding at par and the assumption of state debt. And if you look down here, you've got customs, or tariffs, that we talked about from imports and exports. And then whiskey excise tax that we talked about. And this is just miscellaneous. But in general, though, you're still going to have a huge amount of debt, right? Which has carried on and gotten a whole lot worse. Okay. So, Hamilton was very important, but also very, very polarizing. A lot of people did not like him. Talked about him being a little bit of a narcissist. So what's going to happen then is there's going to be a feud, an epic feud. If you've seen the musical Hamilton or know the music at all, they go back to this feud between Jefferson and Hamilton a ton. And that's, obviously you have it with Burr, but Jefferson, he was a little bit more political and not as personal. Anyway. When Washington was elected president, there were not really political parties. Now, we did have some factions. We had originally the Whigs and the Tories, Patriots and the Loyalists, and the Anti-Federalists and the Federalists. Well, now there really is going to start to be political parties. The difference is that now they continue to exist and last outside certain issues and outside elections, and they continue to be there. Okay? Okay, so Hamilton's ideas, we already talked about kind of his fiscal beliefs, but he believes that a bank in the United States is very necessary, and that in order to collect taxes, and in order to collect tariffs, that there needs to be a bank, a national federal bank. And it is a private bank, but the United States basically pours in a ton of its resources into it. There you go. And they would be in charge of printing paper money so that you get on a national currency, because that has been an issue in the past. We talked about that with the American Revolution. Each state was just printing money that became worthless, and so now to have a federal money. Well, Jefferson, so remember, there's 3 positions on this cabinet, and he is the Secretary of State. And he also has a very strong word with Washington, and believes that this bank should not be allowed because it is not in the Constitution. Nowhere in this Constitution does it say that the government can have a kind of a federal bank. And so he's going to be known as kind of having a strict construction interpretation of the Constitution. That means it's very strict. What is in the Constitution is what is in it, and the government cannot go outside of what's listed. Therefore, he's a strong states' rights believer. And so those are kind of the 2 big sides. The states' rights, and Hamilton is all about strong federal, strong central government. So Jefferson says, no, it's not in there, strict construction. Hamilton comes back and says, well, it is and it isn't in there. Let me move this out of the way. So this line right here is called the elastic clause that is in the Constitution. Alright, Congress has the power to pass laws that are necessary and proper. necessary and proper to enforce kind of their role. So, is a bank necessary and proper to collect taxes? Taxes, that is in the Constitution, because remember, it wasn't in the Articles of Confederation. So, it's called elastic because it stretches, right? It says, well, the government can do this and it can do this because it's necessary and it's proper. So an elastic clause or necessary and proper clause. And so this is going to be known as a loose construction of the Constitution. So loose and strict. Loose gives the federal government more power, and strict gives the states more power. Alright, this is a big deal. Washington is trying to listen to Jefferson's opinions, and he's trying to listen to Hamilton's opinions, and we'll listen to the rap battle from Hamilton in class. But ultimately, the bank gets approved. Washington leans towards Hamilton's ear here, and the bank gets approved. That's a big deal. Because a lot of people think that the government is overstepping their boundary. Well, now, the Whiskey Rebellion. Okay. So, in America at this time, the people are 90% rural still. A lot of agriculture still dominates, right? Only 5%, though, live west of the Appalachian Mountains. So they're still really bottled up there. And slowly, people are getting over to the Appalachian Mountains, but those are really rugged lives because there's not a lot. Transportation's bad, communication's bad, everything. So, the Whiskey Rebellion, almost all the rebellions we talked about happen with the backcountry people, right? So, this is no different. This is West Pennsylvania, born and raised. That I put in it different. Okay, West Pennsylvania, 1794, and we talked about the excise tax that Hamilton had on whiskey. Well, whiskey was kind of a currency for a lot of people in the backcountry because it's easier to transport than the crops, the grain that they grow. Okay, so quick lesson on whiskey is that you make it from grain. And instead of transporting all of that, it's much easier to just turn it into whiskey and use that as a payment. I think we talked about that. Okay, well, they have a rebellion, and this sounds similar to the last rebellion, which was Shays. Shays Rebellion, how did that get solved? Some rhetorical questions. Eventually, there was no national army to come turn it down, right? So that kind of showed that they needed a stronger constitution. So now, this is the first rebellion that's happened since the new constitution, since, Washington has his role. So he orders an army from multiple states. So this is really testing the Constitution. Are multiple states going to join in here? The answer is yes, they do. They come in here and it's pretty much already crushed, but it crushed a rebellion and it shows the government's strength. So, honestly, I think if this had not gone well, you could have seen a turn in the tide of the states and kind of the federal government coming together. People might have been frustrated. I really think a lot could have happened here if they did not shut this down. Okay? Side note, though, is what group of people is going to be frustrated by this? Backcountry. Okay, so think about it in the terms we talked about before. Federalists or anti-federalists. Anti-federalists, right? They're kind of disgusted by this show of power. Like, did Washington really need to bring an army from multiple states to shut this down? On a law that is already hurting us and that we disagree with? So, political parties eventually come out of this. And we're going to talk about it. I guess something I want you to know now is, although this has kind of a linear kind of arrows down, they're not totally the same, so don't get caught up in this. There's a lot of changes in beliefs. And anyway, so Anti-Federalist and Federalist. Hamilton was a Federalist, right? Strong central government. So that term is going to kind of stick around, the Federalist. However, a new political party is going to come out called the rising out of the Anti-Federalists. Okay, but they're going to be called, I think I can do this. Booyah. The Democratic Republicans. Okay, but pretty much known as the Republicans as well. So if you hear that, Democratic Republicans, but also just the Republicans. Okay. All right. So it's massive feud between the two superpowers, pretty much, and political parties arise out of this. So let's just talk through the main ideas here. We've already said it. Hamilton has a strong central government. That's what he believes in. He wants to raise revenue, and how do you raise revenue? Through taxes, like the excise tax. He believed in the Bank of the United States, and the Elastic Clause, right? The Federalist Party is really going to come out from him. And another thing here is, in general, well, I guess I'll get back to that. Okay. Jefferson, on the other hand, is going to emphasize states' rights. We already talked about that. And individual rights as well. He's going to have the Democratic Republicans. Okay, so ready? Which party here tended to support the rich? Hamilton. Right, sorry, the Federalists. And so Jefferson was more the agrarian, to be more poor. Okay, which party supported manufacturers and business owners? That would be Hamilton's Federalists. Where were those where were those manufacturers located? In the North, so a lot of his support came from the North, from wealthy business owners, where Jefferson got his support more from the South, more agrarian, and the West, also more agrarian. Okay? So, you have that kind of not duel, because poor Hamilton got known for another duel. That feud going on, and in it, you jumps a big event in the world that's really going to start splitting America even more. It's the French Revolution. I'm not sure if you learned this in world history, but this is one of my favorite things to teach, is the French Revolution, when I was taught world history, because it was crazy, chaos. So America, we had our revolution, and shortly after, France is going to have a revolution, because they have a king that's the Palace of Versailles and lived this fancy life, and the people are over it, over the aristocrats ruling everything. And so it started out peacefully. And the Americans in general supported it. They're pursuing a republic, and they supported it. But then all of a sudden, it turned into really, bloody and extremely bloody. This guy named Robespierre comes in, and with the invention of the guillotine, have you heard of the guillotine? Kind of got a picture here down below. But it would happen in public, and they would go and literally chop the heads off of people in front of everybody, with this sharp blade. You can see that guy holding the head up right here. And thousands of people were killed. Wealthy aristocrats, even the king and queen literally their heads are going to be chopped off in front of people. So now it becomes a little bit crazier. And people in America not everybody's going to support this because of how crazy it's going to become. What group of people would be scared of this reign of terror in France, in America? The Federalists, the wealthy, because aristocrats, even though much less aristocratic than in France, they were scared because they thought that this could come to America and our heads could be chopped off. Well, eventually, this is going to really bleed into Europe, as most of those wars did. And Britain's going to be brought into war, and so France and Britain are going to basically kind of go at each other. So, who should America support? Do they, A, support Britain because of the strong economic tie they have to them? And Hamilton really believes that in order for America to become strong and powerful and economically successful, they need to have a relationship with Britain. Or, option B, do they join with France because France was a military ally in America's revolution, and they helped them win? So what do they choose? Well, this becomes a really hot question, hot debates in America. And you've got the Federalists going against the Democratic Republicans. The Democratic Republicans, the Jefferson's party, they're going to support entering war on behalf of France. That's who they're going for. Well, ultimately, Washington, extremely wise moment here, is going to proclaim neutrality, in that he's not going to enter war on either side. And part of this was financial. Is if we join one side, we're probably going to get blockaded, and that we can't export things. So that was, but the other reason was they thought that we are such a young nation that if we enter this war, we could be kind of, that means Britain will go to war with us, or France will go to war with us, and everything we just earned in the American Revolution could be kind of thrown away. That we're too new of a nation to get involved. Now, that idea right there, that neutrality proclamation, is going to stick with America's identity for a long, long time, and a lot of people would argue that it's still somewhat of an idea we have today. Of, do we get involved in other wars if they're not our wars? So Washington definitely had that effect. So now that we're neutral, we are getting in some skirmishes with Britain, and Britain's almost going to kind of pull us into war here. And actually, France is almost going to pull us into war because they're both mad at us basically for not joining in. So if you kind of look up on this picture here, Britain is still going to have, some forts up here. Do you see these red dots? Those are forts that Britain still occupies, even though they are either on the border or in American territory. And that's really going to frustrate a lot of colonists. And what the British are going to try to do are try and start fights with some of the Native Americans there with us, and so that might ultimately break into something larger. So eventually there is a battle with the Little Turtle with the Miami Confederacy here, and it's basically a lot of Americans died from an attack by the Miamis. However, as what is often true with Native American attacks, is that Americans are going to retaliate harder and kind of bigger, and it's going to result in finally a Treaty of Greenville. You can see this. Let me do that. Okay, right here you see the Treaty of Greenville is basically going to give us a line of where now, if the Native Americans stay behind here, then we won't attack them, and you're going to see that happen really throughout the Native American history of these treaties, and then we pass them, and there's a conflict, and then we push them back even further, and so that is just an example of that. Okay, so we're having some skirmishes here with Britain. So what's going to happen is John Jay is going to be sent to Britain to kind of come up with a treaty to stop kind of all this. All right, so in this treaty, a couple things are going to happen. Is number one, that he's going to kind of force Britain to get out of these forts that they have continued to own. Okay, sorry about that. Kid issue. Okay, so back to Jay's Treaty. So a lot of kind of conflicts going on between the British and the Americans. One thing I didn't mention was this idea of impressment. We'll talk about that again later. But the idea, impressment is essentially when one country takes people from another country's ship and puts them on their boat, or takes a hold of their boat, but kind of forces them to work on their boat. So that was happening. The British were doing that as well. So in general, Jay's Treaty is, the whole purpose is to avoid war with Britain. And so John Jay goes over there, and it's a very favorable treaty towards Britain. Now, the British do have to, are supposed to, abandon their forts, help kind of stop the impressment of soldiers, and pay for damage to vessels. But the Americans actually had to do something as well. They had to pay their debts back that they hadn't done before the Revolutionary War, and they also had to be a little bit restrictive in their trade with France. So at the end of this, they're being restrictive towards France and paying war debts and things like that. This is a favorable treaty to Britain, so who's going to be frustrated? Two groups. France, right? And who else would not like this? Sorry, the Democratic Republicans, right? Because they are pro-France. So that Jay's Treaty, if you can see in that picture right there, it's a little intense, but is really going to light the flame between the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists again. Now, coincidentally, at this time, Pinckney's Treaty is going to be signed with Spain, and basically Spain is saying, I need to get on board here as well, and this is actually very favorable to the Americans, and Spain does two big things here. One, they allow the Americans allow usage of the Mississippi River, and they're going to allow the Americans to have Florida back. So that is definitely a successful treaty for them. Alright. Well, whenever I see Washington's Farewell, I always think of Hamilton's music again. But Washington decides to step down. This is a really big deal. So it's only for 2 terms. It's going to set the precedent for America. Now, he easily could have stayed as long as he wanted, potentially. He could, because they're used to a monarch, and maybe if the monarch was under control by the checks and balances, then maybe they would allow it. So this is huge, the fact that he only does 2 terms, and really sets it up for the future of America, except for FDR. And FDR is going to be the only president to break that. And then an amendment comes later to stop that from happening again. Okay, but in his farewell address, if you look at this right here, I'm going to read that bottom part. It is our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world. Okay, that's huge. Stay clear of alliances. He's especially talking about peacetime alliances. You're in peacetime, why do you need to, he's going to call them entangling alliances. They entangle you. Because right now, America was in an entangling alliance with France. And this is going to be a really interesting thing as well for the future of America, because we are going to try and stay out of entangling alliances, but it's going to get harder and harder. And today, are we in entangling alliances in peacetime? Yeah, we are. We'll get more into that. But even though we are, he still really pursued an isolationist strategy. And isolation means America's going to stay isolated, even though there's all these other things going on in the world. We're going to isolate ourselves. Why get involved in something? And that has been a common thread, even though a lot of things in our history have pulled us out of that. But okay, so that's a big deal. Who becomes president? John Adams, the vice president. He's going to fight to become president over Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson loses and becomes his vice president, which is pretty crazy. Can you imagine, like this last election, Trump being president and Hillary being vice president? Would not work so well. That changes later. Okay, so John Adams inherits basically a big French issue. The French are mad, and they're mad because of Jay's Treaty, right? So what John Adams tries to do is he sends over an envoy, basically some diplomats, to go meet with the French and make some peacetime a little bit. Peace. Well, what happens is the XYZ affair. It's so scandalous. Basically, 3 people approach our envoy and say, they try to basically bribe us. Oh yeah, you want to meet with our minister here? Okay, pay us a huge amount of money and you can meet with them. Not even saying that this meeting will go well. So a huge bribe, and this is a big offending America. I mean, imagine that today if somebody tried to do that. Oh, you want to meet with Putin? Great, pay $3 million and we'll talk about it. $3 million, whatever. So this basically incites the Americans even more. This becomes famous. Millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute. What does that mean? It means we're not giving you any money, France. We're backing out of that. We're done with you. We'll defend ourselves, but we won't give you money for... We'll fight for ourselves, but we're not going to pay for you to fight. So, another almost war here with France, but Napoleon actually becomes the dictator here. And if you know anything about Napoleon, pretty crazy guy, he's going to try and take over Europe. So he's not really concerned about America at that point. So he's going to kind of set up this convention of 1800 in which he basically says, all right, this alliance that we had is done. We're not enemies. We're just not expecting alliance in peacetime, especially. So that's a big deal, and really that's going to help us because that was actually we avoided war with France. That's going to help later get the Louisiana Purchase. That's a very big deal later. Okay, kind of closing up here. So in general, the whole French Revolution thing really caused a lot of turmoil in America. And one of the biggest reasons is because it was an early nation. And you're having these political parties rise up. And could they sustain this division? Okay, so Federalists are in charge. I don't think I said that with John Adams. John Adams is a Federalist. He went against the Jefferson's Democratic Republicans, right? Okay, so there's actually going to be a ton of hate spewed in this election, and kind of from here on out for a while, a lot of hate. I mean, to be honest, today we're still dealing with a lot of hate between political parties, right? Okay, well, the Federalists versus the Jeffersonians, which ones were poor? The Democratic Republicans, right? And they also tend to be more immigrants because immigrants tended to be poor and working the hard jobs. Well, at this point, the Federalists are going to pass the alien laws, basically the alien and sedition laws here. Alien, if you know that word today, alien basically, you're not a citizen. And this was about two things. Is they extended the time it took for a immigrant to become nationalized, become a citizen, from 5 years to 14 years. Because they didn't want all these immigrants coming in and having the right to vote and then being able to vote out the Federalists. So, and also it allowed them, the president, to deport immigrants who were dangerous in times of war. Imagine that today, right? If all of a sudden the president says, boom, I'm tripling the time that you need to become citizens so you can't vote for me, and I'm going to deport you if I feel like you are dangerous right now. I realize I'm touching the hot topic there. Okay, Sedition Act goes along with this. Sedition, anybody know what sedition means? It means kind of you're saying lies. So here, Sedition Act, again, the Federalists passed this, and they said that they could basically put anybody in prison who said something that went against government officials. So, remember before the Zenger trial when it said, yes, you do have freedom of speech, and you can say things about corrupt governors and things like that. Here, it's basically taking that away. You cannot say these things, and you could get thrown in jail because we are in a time of war. We might go to war with France right now, or with Britain, and if you come out and say anything about our government, who knows what could happen. So that was a huge right taken away. And if you look at the Federalists versus Jeffersonians, who's more about Bill of Rights here and individual rights? That would be the Democratic Republicans. So Jefferson is trying to think of a way to, these laws are ridiculous and they're unconstitutional, he thinks. So he's going to help write the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, which basically say that he believes the Alien and Sedition Acts are unconstitutional. These take away rights that are fundamental in our Constitution. And so, because they're unconstitutional as a state, we essentially give the government, the federal government, their power. Their power comes from the states, right? We're giving that to them. So if we decide that a law is unconstitutional, we don't have to listen to it. We can nullify that law. And Virginia and Kentucky went for it. No other states went for it. And so it did not become this mass exit or anything like that. And that really just shows you that people were a little bit more leaning towards this wartime hysteria, and we need to do what we can to limit, anything that could hurt us as a nation. Okay, so this is just kind of in summary here. The political parties are dividing more, and what's going to happen now that these political parties have developed? Now we have hindsight bias, so we know what's going to happen. But back then, they don't know that, all this anger and saying bad things about the other leaders, and could it divide the country? It could, right? So anyway, you should know in general kind of the Federalist features and the Democratic feature, Republican features, and that's just a good chart for you. Okay? All right. See ya Thursday. Thursday we're going to do some activities and take the quiz at the end and watch some videos. Okay, bye.